And we start with Jacob. So this is Genesis 33, verses 18 to 19. Okay, so Genesis 33, verses 18 to 19. So in Genesis 33, verses 18 to 19, here we start with Jacob. And what we see is this. So, and Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram. It sounds like this. When I was younger, I used to watch this show called Bananarama. It kind of reminded me of that. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But anyway, and he pitched his tent before the city, and he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money, and he erected there an altar and called it Elelo Israel. Okay, so Jacob bought a plot of land, a parcel here of land, and this was in Canaan. He bought it for 100 pieces of money. It doesn't say what kind of value that money had, but he bought it for 100 pieces of that money. Okay, so this is an aside, right? So Jacob bought this field and he has it, but it turns out that Jacob, when he dies, when he passes away, he's not going to be buried in that field. He's going to be buried in that same cave where Abraham buried Sarah, right? So this is in chapter 35 of Genesis, verse 9 through 15. Okay, so Genesis 35, 9 through 15. And God appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padan Aram, and blessed him. And God said unto him, Thy name is Jacob, thy name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be thy name. And he called his name Israel. So that's when Jacob then becomes Israel. And God said unto him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. And the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed after thee will I give the land. And God went out from him in the place where he had talked with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, even a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering thereon, and he poured oil thereon. So God continues to remind the generation of Abraham that he has made this promise with the seed of Abraham, that this land, Canaan, will belong to them at some point, right? He originally made that promise with Abraham that we read in Genesis 15. But then in the meantime here, Abraham passed away, Sarah passed away, Abraham passed away, Isaac passed away, and then Jacob is now living, but God reminds them of this promise that he made with Abraham. All right, and then finally, so we fast forward again in time, because of course we can do that. This is like fast forwarding with the. Oh, did somebody have a question or a comment?
It's a comment because you talked about buying a cave, and you talked about Abraham buying property, and you talked about Isaac buying property, and remind everybody that in our reading assignment this time around, one of the things that Jeremiah was told to do by God was to buy a piece of property, despite the fact that Jeremiah was prophesying that they would all be taken into Babylon. God had him buy a piece of property. So buying that property is a symbol of the land promise that God made to them, and also a symbol of their trust in God. You know, they say, pray for rain, but plow your field. And that's exactly what they've done.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Ted. Ted's comment was a very good comment, obviously. And so that's what's going on now. You know, they're in Canaan, but then things are going to turn for the worse here shortly. So Genesis 49, verse 29 to 32. We're kind of fast forwarding in time here. And this is where Jacob now passes away. Jacob now, whose name has been changed to Israel, right? So 49, 29 to 32. And it says, and he charged them and said unto them, um, well, let me just let's start with 28. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is it that their fathers spake unto them and blessed them, every one according to his blessing he blessed them. And he charged them, and he said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. And then verse 31, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife, and they buried Isaac and Rebekah and his wife, and there I buried Leah, who was one of Jacob's wives. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet unto the bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered unto his people. So Jacob also asked to be buried in that same cave in the land of Canaan, right? In which Abraham and Sarah were buried. Isaac and Rebekah were also buried there. And his wife, Leah, was also buried there. And so now we have Jacob and Leah buried in that cave, as well as Isaac, Rebekah, Abraham, and Sarah. And they're all in this cave that resides in the land of Canaan, right? So he was buried there, and so in Genesis 15:13, we get finally the here it's more clear. It says, "For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with a field for a possession of a burying place of Ephron the Hittite before Mamre." So, so he is buried in the land of Canaan. All right, so the promise was made. In Genesis 15, we read that God made this promise with Abraham that that land was going to belong to them. And then also, now we're going to see what's happening with the generations that follow. So now we go to Genesis 50 in verses 22 to 26. Now these are the descendants of Jacob, right? The 12 tribes of Israel, of which Joseph is one of the sons one of the sons of Jacob or Israel. And his mom was Leah, one of the people that was buried in that cave, right? So Genesis 50 verses 22 to 26 says, and Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, the children also of Mashir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Because Joseph at this point was in Egypt. Remember, Joseph was a governor of Egypt, and he was held in great esteem by the Pharaoh. And so Joseph was there as one of the sons of Israel. And he brought all of his brothers and the one sister, Dinah, and brought them all in, and they were residing in Egypt. But he said, before he started dying, and Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So here Joseph died, and he asked the children of Israel to make a promise for him that when they went back to the land of Canaan, that they would take his bones and bury him there in the land of Canaan, right? And this is a promise that he asked of the children of Israel. Now, this is before the subjugation began, and they were saying, okay, so we'll take you over there, right? Because what happens after generations, they forgot, the new rulers of Egypt forgot about Joseph, and they began suppressing and enslaving the Jews. They began suppressing and enslaving the Israelites, right? And but they had this promise that they made to Joseph that they were going to take him to the land of Canaan. So in Exodus, now we kind of fast forward again in time. So that's what I was telling you. We're going to take a trip through time. So Exodus chapter 12. All right. So Exodus chapter 12. This is we're kind of going in warp speed through time to follow the Star Trek. So now Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 to 41. And it says, if I can find it here. Okay. This is okay, so let's just start reading here. So it says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So we're kind of going way past now, and Moses has already, come through, and they're about to get ready to leave Egypt. And it says here, the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So they stayed in Egypt for 430 years, right? And then it says, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And so now they're, after 430 years of enslavement and subjugation by the Egyptians, the children of Israel are finally leaving Egypt, right? And here in Exodus 13, verses 19 through 20, it says, and Moses, okay, when everybody's leaving, now this is a massive undertaking, right? Because they started out with only a few people 430 years ago, but now they have millions of people that are leaving. So, I mean, millions of people are exiting Egypt. If you've ever looked at the news for, when, there's wars in Syria, civil wars in Syria, and other places in the Middle East, and they cause these refugees to leave their country because they want to escape these horrors of war. You see massive numbers of people leaving right now. Imagine millions of people leaving with not just people, with all their possessions, all they had, they're all leaving, right? So this was a massive undertaking. And so, but what happens is they didn't forget one thing, because in Exodus 13, 19 through 20, it says, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. And they took their journey from Succoth and encamped in Etham in the edge of the wilderness. So they remembered after 430 years, right? I mean, how many of us can remember? Well, obviously, none of us here can remember anything from 430 years ago, but how much history has passed from 430 years ago? Some of that history is probably lost by now, right? In books, even. And yet, this was remembered after 430 years, right? That Joseph was buried in Egypt, and he swore to he made the children of Israel swear that they would take his bones and bury them in Canaan, because that was the promised land, and he believed it. And the people that took his bones also believed it, and they were witnessing the promise that how do you say? They were witnessing the fulfillment of that promise that God made, right? They were witnessing, they were part of it. And they didn't forget Joseph's bones. And so after 430 years, plus the 40 years where they pilgrimed, they wondered about the desert, so it's about 470 years. They had the bones Joseph's bones with them that entire time. So again, we go fast forward again in time. And maybe I went a little bit too fast here in time because I only have a few more verses left here. Now we go to Joshua. Okay, so we skipped all this the Torah, which is what the Jewish people call the first 5 books, and we go to Joshua chapter 21. Now this is after the children of Israel have already wandered through the desert, and they finally were given a chance by God to go take the land of Canaan, right? And so there was Joshua led the armies, and they went in and they took over the land of Canaan. So they're already there at Canaan, and this is Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 to 45. Okay. And in these verses it says, "And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he swore to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about according to that he swore unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies before them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hands. There failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass." So we looked at the promise that God made to Abraham back in Genesis 15. And here, 470 plus years later, all of those promises that God made to the children of Israel came to pass. And not one thing, it says here in the Bible, not one thing did not come to pass. Everything came to pass. Everything that God had promised came to pass at this point in time when they were already in the land of Canaan. Which is, I mean, if you think about this whole scenario, this happened over 470 plus years, right? Over 470 plus years, Abraham had spoken to God, and God told him, "I'm going to give you this land, but your descendants are going to be subjugated for 400 years," and that also came to pass, right? And then finally, Joseph had enough trust in the Lord to to make the children of Israel swear that they would take his bones and not let them lay there in the land of Egypt, because that was not their property, that was not their land, right? The promised land was in Canaan. And even though it was 430 years later that it will happen, Joseph had enough faith in the word of God to tell the Israelites, to promise them that they would take his bones and with them to Canaan. And that came to pass, right? That is the faith that they had. It did not die down for the 430 years. For some it did. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why they wandered in the desert for 40 years. But as a whole, they kept their faith in God and the promise that God had made. And they kept it throughout that entire time. One last verse here in the Old Testament, Joshua 24, verses 31 to 32. So this is Joshua 24, 31 to 32. And it says, "And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua." This is the land of Israel. So they're kind of, the verse here is treating Israel as a person, but that person is the whole population of Israel, right? "And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that overlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem in a parcel of ground with Jacob, which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. And it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph." And so there is kind of like the end, right? God made this promise over 470 years ago. And finally here in in Joshua, we see that Joseph's bones were finally buried in this property that was bought by Joseph's dad, who was Jacob, right, in the land of Canaan. And then that property now served as an inheritance for all of Joseph's kids, right? And it was an inheritance because Jacob bought it and it was rightfully his, right? And then Joseph was buried in there. He was part of that inheritance. And then everybody else after Joseph had that inheritance. And that in itself is also a promise that was made by God and fulfilled by God, right? So if you think about it, this is after 470 years, maybe about 500, say 500 years, right? Because we don't really know the exact number of years. So let's say it's about half a millennia, right? So that's 500 years is half a millennia. Millennia is 1,000 years, right? God, Jesus, made us a promise, right? So now we go to the New Testament, and this is John 14. So John 14, verses 1 through 3. And incidentally, John 14 is going to be what the sermon's going to be too. So John 14, verses 1 through 3 says, "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me." This is a conversation that Jesus Christ was having with his apostles, with his disciples. "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." Now, to me, that sounds like a promise, right? I don't know what it sounds to you, but to me, that sounds like a promise that Jesus made, right? And so just as having that example that God made that promise with Abraham and his descendants in the Old Testament, and he kept that promise, right? It was after about 500 years, after a half a millennia. Now Jesus here in the New Testament makes us a promise that he will be coming back again to take us with him, right? Now that's a promise. And well, it's only, if you take 500 years, and I sometimes deal with math, right? If you take 500 years as one time frame, just call it a time frame, right? Right now, we're living in the fourth time frame, right? 2,000 years after Christ. So it hasn't been that long, right? It's only been 4 time frames, right? If you relate it to the 500 years that it took God's promise to take place with the children of Israel. So it hasn't been too long. It's only been 4 time frames, right? Year 2000. So Jesus made that promise, and we have to better believe that he will keep that promise, because he's shown us that he keeps those promises, right? And so those are at least my words of encouragement, especially during these troubled times. And so that was the end of my Bible study. I went through warp speed majorly here because I was meaning to have it done in 45 minutes, but I think I went through too fast a little bit. But I just want to open it up to discussion in terms of what we just talked about.
I think what I thought of when you were talking about how for 430 years the people remembered, and that was people teaching their children, but it goes to show that God's way, there's always going to be a way that God's fulfillment will happen, and that all is not lost. So there will always be faithful people to God. And that's an encouragement.
Yeah, that's true. And that also is, that point that you raise is a pretty good one, because the way that they didn't forget about God's promise was that the fathers and the mothers taught their